what is going on right now between the United States and Iran. We had Israeli-American attack on Iranians, and in the initial hours, they assassinated the supreme leader of Iran, some commanders in Iran. And the attacks is somehow escalating the way that all bases, U.S. bases in the Middle East were hit. Some of them were in Bahrain, were obliterated, as Donald Trump likes this word. But the escalation is going beyond what it seems that Donald Trump had it in his mind, and it's getting Tel Aviv is getting hit, Tehran is getting a lot of attacks, and a lot of some parts are destroyed. You see, and there is some sort of total chaos when you look at what is happening right now. What is your understanding of of this conflict that is escalating?
Well, I think the problem, as we have seen in other conflicts, by the way, is the inability of the West to understand its adversary, to understand the posture of the adversary. You see, when we talk about what happened on Saturday and yesterday, uh, we just have to consider what happened before first to understand the position of Iranians. Early this year, you had, under the auspices of Russia, you had a dialogue established between Iran and Israel. And the idea was to have a kind of non-aggression pact to be signed by the two parties. And that was done by the Russian diplomacy, by the way. Later, we had earlier this month, I mean, the month of, not this month, but the previous one, February, we had the talks in Geneva with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. I mean, the first round, I mean, this round of negotiation in January were between Israel and Iran. And then in Geneva, you had the talks between the United States and Iran. We have seen on this occasion, and by the way, about the first round of talks, this was at the request of Israel. So Israel requested to have some kind of non-aggression agreement. As it comes to the talks with the US, we have seen that the US have systematically increased their demands and gone to the point where all the demands could not be fulfilled by the Iranians. I mean, asking to jeopardize literally their national security by abandoning ballistic missile and things like this. Reminding here people that the Iranian ballistic missiles are non-nuclear so far. And and therefore, if you look at this, and then you see what happened on Saturday, what would be your position as Iranian? You see, well, those guys, they ask us talk to improve the situation, to have some kind of dialogue, and then they take advantage of that to strike us. And they even strike us jointly because this was decided. I mean, this joint operation was decided in early February. I mean, on the 11th of February, as as Netanyahu was visiting Trump in Washington D.C., meaning that even during the whole negotiation process, the Israelis and the Americans were planning an operation against Iran. But that means that from the Iranian perspective, how can you trust your partners? I mean, partners, not partners, but your counterparts. How can you trust them? They talk, they openly. I mean, they at face value, it's about peace and dialogue, but behind the scene, they are struggling to organize operations against you. So we are now in a situation where Iran has been struck by both countries. as you said before, apparently there is a division of labor between the US and the Israelis. The Israelis are strike what is related to the leadership and the command and control system of the armed forces, including the revolution, the guardian of the revolution. And the Americans strike the infrastructures, such as the nuclear infrastructure and things like this. So that's what looks like. Now, in the first day, you had already about 40 people of the Iranian leadership that had been killed, including Ali Khamenei. But not only. And that's very interesting, by the way, that the Israeli didn't miss the opportunity to keep their tradition alive and stroke a school in Tehran, killing 160 children. So we see that despite the narrative that they go on very precise, and they are able to do very precise strikes, but those precise strikes also strike children, as we have seen in Palestine. So we have something here that, by the way, no media in the West have reported. I've seen yesterday the report of the Belgian TV. They have spoken about the 9 people who were killed as a result of the Iranian retaliation in Tel Aviv, but there was no single word about the 160 school children who have been killed in Tehran. So Iran now is in a position that it cannot really trust people, even for talks, for a dialogue, for a diplomatic action. And but this also must be added to the fact that we had, in the previous 2 years, we had several attacks from Israel to Iran, attacking individuals in Iran. And therefore, the Iranians at this stage know that if they stop their retaliation or their response, and if you have a ceasefire or some kind of appeasement in that, that will only serve the purpose of rearming Israel and the US. So they know that they are condemned to strike stronger and stronger. In fact, Iran is put in a position that it has to escalate to some extent. And that's the tragic of the situation, because there is no way Iran can now trust any diplomatic initiative coming from the US. And the US is the only discussion or dialogue partner you can have. Israel is no partner at all. Europe is inexistent diplomatically. The US was the only power that was more or less willing to talk to the Iranians. But even that, we saw that it was just an exercise in duplicity by the Americans. So now, who can you trust? The only way is to bring the conflict to the point that both Israel and the US will have to beg for peace. That's where we are. And that's because the Iranian cannot trust any peace or dialogue initiative coming from the US. From the Israeli, we can probably forget that. But so we are in a very tragic situation. Iran is a country that has much bigger resources than we think. And it is probably able and resilient enough to sustain, let's say, some kind of attrition war let's put it that way, because their resources are not infinite. Their ability to fight is probably not infinite. The number of missiles they have, or drones, or whatever, is not infinite. But probably they have prepared for such a situation. And my understanding of the way of Iran think about this situation is that Iran has planned for such a protracted war against the US and Israel. On the other hand, the US, in fact, has failed in his first attempt to overthrow the regime. It has killed Ali Khamenei, but it's not killing the leader is not overthrowing the regime, and that's very important to understand that. And why do I say it failed? It failed because the Americans and the Israelis, because obviously let's say the obvious objective of the whole operation was precisely to have this regime change. But to have a regime change, the problem is that the assumption of the West in general, and the US and Israel in particular, was that the Iranian population hate the regime. And that, and I've seen also some journalists in Switzerland saying that 80% of the population is ready to overthrow the regime, because, in fact, the whole Iran just holds because of a small elite that keeps the power. And I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Iranian society, the Iranian system, and Iran as a country functions. And the problem is that when we see, and then we have seen in January all these demonstration protests and things like this, what the media fail to say is that all these pictures or movies that we see come from some cities, and very often large cities, but they may not be replicated in other parts of the country. And that's something that I noticed during the riots that you had in 2009. When I started to study these riots across the country, I noticed that, in fact, those riots were concentrated just on a few cities. But the main part of the country didn't feel the need of having any kind of revolt and things like this. And so our perception of the Iranian society is false, and has probably led Trump and his advisors that if you just give a small impulsion to the opposition, the whole country would then erupt in a kind of a revolution and then change the regime. And it's very fascinating, because if I were someone who would plan for regime change, I would certainly not have done what the Americans have done. Remember, you had those riots in January that were largely sponsored by the US, and even the US confessed that through economic measures and monetary measures. They create a situation where you had some ground for dissatisfaction in the Iranian population. And then you remember all these the episode of the Starlink terminals that were smuggled into Iran in order to create some kind of networks in order to foster a revolution. So they did that in January. But apparently, this was kept under control by the government. Again, I'm not discussing the number of casualties. I think that here we are in the range of things that are between disinformation and propaganda. There have been certainly some casualties, there is no doubt, but certainly in the size that were reported in our media. In any case, somehow the government managed to keep the whole thing under control. And then in February, we didn't talk about these riots anymore. And suddenly, at the end of the month, comes this strike. In fact, if you would do a real regime change, you would have done exactly the opposite. You would have combined both the military strike and then some riots in order to take the opportunity of because when you change the leadership, even if it was prepared as it was in Iran, because based on the experience of the previous strikes of last year, the 12 days war, Iran prepared for a situation in which the leadership would be eliminated, and then you had to put in place a new leadership. And for that reason, Iran prepared this transition for months. That means that probably all decisions that were taken by the leader the one who was in charge, but probably all decisions were shared with the second in command, if you want, who was planned to take over in case of the killing of the person in charge. So, meaning that Iran prepared this transition, but nevertheless, regardless if this transition is smooth or not, whether it's rapid or slow, a transition is always a moment of weakness. And that's the moment the Americans should have used to then destabilize the government with riots and all that. This didn't happen. They sequenced in the operations, in my view, in a completely wrong way. As a result, I think this regime change has not happened. You had a change of the leaders, but not a regime change. The problem in such a situation, and that's something that I've studied in many in many articles that I've written on the issue, is when you start killing leaders, the danger is that you don't know who will be next. You know those who are in charge, but you don't know who will come after them. And therefore, when you start killing the leaders, you put yourself in a situation of uncertainty as how these new leaders will react and how they will respond to the situation. Very often, and that's the experience that I've looked at for instance, in Palestine with the Hamas. Each time Israel has killed a Palestinian leader, the next one was always someone who was more, let's say, more tough. It was always a tougher person, while they killed people who were they were open to dialogue, but the one who replaced was no longer ready for dialogue and was much more in favor of a tougher stance. So, meaning that by killing leaders, you degrade your own situation. And that's something that I described in my book on asymmetric warfare, because that's exactly how I define asymmetric warfare. It's a situation in which each move you make in order to improve your situation, in fact, degrades your own situation. And that's exactly what we have seen with in Palestine for years with Israel, and they do exactly the same with Iran. When you start killing leaders, then you have the risk of having more effective, more aggressive, and more efficient and more dynamic, younger leaders. And that's probably what we'll have. Therefore, Israel and the US have, in fact, degraded their own strategic posture in that. So that's how I see that. That's the reason why I have the feeling that Iran is now obliged to escalate the conflict up to the point where Iran and the US have no other choice than begging for peace. and not for ceasefire, but for peace. And my personal view, if I were Iranian, I would certainly do in a strategy, harder strategy, but beyond the point where Israel and US would ask for peace. You have to go beyond that point, because you have to make sure that it's not just that they want peace, but they need peace. And that's where that's the situation in which we are. I don't know. I'm not in the Iranian leadership, but as I understand from what I've seen so far, the Iranian leadership, generally speaking, without going into the specifics, because we don't know the new leaders, but I assume they are in the same vein as the others, they think in a very strategic way. And my feeling, because apparently Trump has already made some indications that he would start a discussion, and Iranians have said no. So my feeling is that the Iranians tend to think a little bit, just as I explained, that they feel that we need to go now further than during the 12-day wars, the 12 days war, and we need to go even beyond the point where Israel and the US ask for peace. And that's a little bit the situation where we are. This will be that will cost a lot, many lives, but I think there's no choice, because the problem is that both, when we talk about this war between Iran and US, Iran and Israel, we are in a kind of war that is not rational. Everybody knows that Iran has no claims towards Israel. I mean, there's no territorial claims, there's no economic claims, there is no objective reason for having a war between the US and Iran and Iran and Israel. We are in a war that is driven by obsession. We have heard this from for years now. I mean, it's about 50 years in the US. They want to take Iran down, period. They don't care who is in the power, regardless of who it is. They were, in fact, what happened in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the departure of the Shah was extremely humiliating for the Americans. And they never, and you had other aspects, such as the occupation of the US Embassy by the students and the Guardians of Revolution in just after the revolution, and that was a huge humiliation for the Americans, and they never forgot that, and that is driving, sorry, this obsession against Iran, and therefore, in such a situation, from an Iranian point of view, you cannot expect the Americans to come back to some rationality. And the same with Israel. Why is Israel suddenly, in the years 2005 or something like that, Israel started to designate Iran as an enemy? I mean, this is just out of nowhere. There is no rational explanation for that. It's just obsessive. And therefore you need now to bring them to their knees. This is the only way, because if you make any kind of ceasefire with them, they will come back, and we have seen that in the last 2 years. We have seen that the Israelis have come, I mean, regularly, systematically, they will come back and trying to strike Iran in some way. So there is no way you can talk to them rationally. You have to bring them really down so that they have no other choice than asking for peace.